Applause erupts, then vanishes when a young black student in the back row rises, clutching a crumpled letter no one ever expected to hear, shredding the neat grit versus gifted debate in seconds. Within minutes, the broadcast detonates into a media firestorm, threatening the mocker's career and igniting a nationwide wave of raw, handwritten confession letters. And when the studio lights cut out, one question slashes through the silence. Who truly falls? The one who tells the truth, or the one too afraid to listen? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The studio was ice cold under the hot lights. Face the Divide, live from Washington, D.C., wasn't just another political show. It was a televised collision course. 60 audience members formed a perfect arc around the stage, seated like silent jurors. Overhead, cameras hovered, ready to catch blood. On the screen behind them, Grit versus Gifted. What truly defines success in America? The title burned like a challenge. The crowd was tense, unmoving. Phones were silent. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was personal. Karoline Leavitt walked in first, polished, confident, and dressed for a fight. Her presence screamed order, control, superiority. She believed success came from structure, not struggle. To her, resilience was just a fancy word for excuse. She waved like a victor before the battle even started, her side of America already applauding. Then Jasmine Crockett appeared. No smile, no flash, no need. Just quiet defiance wrapped in a dark dress. Every step she took was a reminder. She didn't arrive through legacy. She clawed her way here. The room shifted. Applause was lighter but deeper, coming from those who recognized what it took to survive with nothing. She didn't sit to perform. She sat to expose. The host leaned in. Tonight we ask, does greatness come from privilege or pain? Cameras tightened on Jasmine's face. No blink, no flinch. Somewhere, someone in the control room whispered, something's about to happen. Because this wasn't debate anymore. This was reckoning. And just when the room began to settle, Karoline leaned forward, smiling like a blade, and delivered a line sharp enough to split the air in half. I don't believe in overcoming hardship, she said, slowly, deliberately, like each word was a scalpel slicing through fabric. Her tone wasn't emotional, it was cold, polished, built for silence. She wasn't just making a point, she was sending a message. That phrase, to me, is nothing more than the language of people who want to justify failure. She paused, just long enough for the weight of it to land. America doesn't need people who've fallen and gotten back up. America needs people strong enough not to fall in the first place. The words didn't land. They exploded. A beat of stillness, then a fracture in the room. Applause came fast, but not from everyone. The first claps were sharp, certain, from the front left section. Suits, tight ties, folded hands now unfolding in satisfaction. It wasn't just support, it was a kind of pride, as if they'd been waiting for someone to finally say it, unfiltered, brutal, unashamed. A few nodded with smug agreement, their smiles thin and triumphant, but not everyone followed. In the middle rows, a few audience members exchanged glances. Others sat frozen, arms crossed tighter, the energy in their bodies shifting from passive to restless. A man in the second row coughed once, deliberately. A woman near the edge blinked hard, her lips tightening as if something inside her recoiled. And on stage, Jasmine Crockett said nothing. She didn't flinch. She didn't frown. She didn't reach for the mic. She simply looked at Karoline and held her gaze. But it wasn't a stare of defiance. It was something more unsettling. It was the gaze of someone who had already lived through what the other woman was only theorizing. Jasmine had heard this argument before, just not in a studio, not with stage lights. She'd heard it when she was 16 and told her GPA wasn't representative. When her landlord raised the rent by $200 with no notice. When her white classmate with lower scores got into law school first because of a more polished essay. This wasn't new, it was just louder. But Jasmine had learned something Karoline hadn't. You don't have to interrupt someone's illusion when you know it's already cracking from within. So she stayed still, like a storm just before the sky rips open. Then, camera 3 moved, quietly, almost instinctively. Not to Jasmine, not to Karoline, but to the back row. There in the outermost curve of the semicircle, a young black woman sat perfectly still. No older than 19. Her white blouse gleamed softly under the studio lights, but her expression was locked in quiet intensity. Her spine was straight, her chin level, her eyes fixed on Jasmine, not blinking, not drifting, not once, as if she were holding her breath. In her lap was a folded piece of paper, 3 creases, corner slightly torn, not decorative, not crisp. It was a letter, aged from being carried too long, maybe inside a backpack, maybe inside a drawer, maybe under a pillow. The kind of letter you write but never send. The kind of truth you don't know where to place. She wasn't part of the panel. She wasn't on any guest list. But something about her presence, silent, focused, unshakable, pulled the lens in. She didn't shift in her seat. She didn't whisper to anyone nearby. She didn't need to. Her face said it all. This moment mattered to her in a way no one else in the room understood. Because Karoline's words weren't just theory to her. They were bullets aimed at people she loved, maybe at herself. And Jasmine, though facing forward, seemed to know the girl was there, like she felt her through the silence. On stage, Karoline adjusted the sleeve of her blazer and leaned back in her chair, satisfied. She thought she had landed the punch. Thought Jasmine's stillness meant she had nothing to say. She mistook discipline for defeat. That was her first mistake. Because Jasmine's silence wasn't surrender. It was readiness. It wasn't hesitation. It was calibration. Karoline had dropped a soundbite. Jasmine was holding a story, one she knew how to aim. Across the room, the girl with the folded letter still hadn't moved. But her grip on the paper was tighter now, fingertips whitening. She wasn't watching a debate. She was watching to see if someone like her would be allowed to exist in this space without apology, without translation, without trimming herself down to be acceptable. And Karoline had no idea. She had no idea that the most dangerous voice in the room wasn't Jasmine. It was the one that hadn't spoken yet. Jasmine exhaled slowly, just once, then sat forward, barely an inch. The kind of movement that doesn't look like much, but anyone who'd grown up around violence, of any kind, would recognize it instantly. Something was about to strike, and this time, it wouldn't miss. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't lean back or lash out. She simply leaned in, and when she spoke, the air in the room changed, not from heat, from history. I was 14 when my mother came home with a plastic bag and a pink slip, she began, her voice low but unmistakably clear. The bag had 2 loaves of bread, a carton of eggs, and a note from the HR department saying she was no longer needed. That was the day I stopped being a kid. She paused, not for effect, but because some memories aren't meant to be said fast. We had $27 left and rent due in 4 days. That night, while some kids were worrying about homework, I was in a stranger's office, scrubbing coffee stains off a mahogany desk I'd never be allowed to sit behind. Her eyes didn't drift from Karoline. I wasn't chasing a dream. I was trying to keep the lights on. She shifted slightly in her seat, not to adjust, but as if the story she was about to tell needed more room in her chest to be said aloud. Lunch became 2 slices of bread with ice cubes in between. We didn't even have peanut butter, just cold starch and hope the bread didn't go moldy before Friday. The room had gone still, dead still. My little brother studied on the floor under the window, not because it was comfortable, but because the street lamp outside was our only light source after 7 p.m., and when it rained, he had to stop. Not because he was tired, but because the light disappeared. She looked around the room now, slowly without blinking. I didn't grow up knowing what extra credit was. I knew what late fees were. I knew what it meant when your landlord slipped a folded notice under the door without knocking. I learned how to read lease agreements before I learned how to balance equations. Because one mistake, one misunderstood clause, could mean sleeping in a different zip code the next day. Her hands didn't move, but her voice sharpened. You talk about people who never fall. That's privilege talking. I didn't fall because I was careless. I fell because the ground beneath me was never solid to begin with. Her tone didn't rise, but the tension did. You call my story an excuse. I call it a resume, not the one I print on nice paper. The one that taught me how to survive rooms like this. Rooms that look down on people like me before they've even said a word. She inhaled once, deeply, then continued. My education didn't come in a straight line. It came in nights I couldn't sleep because the roaches in our apartment came out when the heat went off. It came from translating every piece of legal paper our family received because my mother never made it past the 10th grade. I learned what predatory lending meant the day we lost our second car. I learned what due process meant when the school suspended my brother for not having the right uniform. She turned back to Caroline now, her eyes steady. So no, I didn't go to school to get a gold star or a framed degree for a wall we couldn't afford to hang pictures on. I went to school because I was tired of not understanding the fine print that let people lie to my mother's face and still win. Her voice dipped lower, more focused. I didn't go to class for applause. I went so I'd never again stand in front of a landlord who told me rent had gone up and pretend to understand why. Then she said it, the sentence that hit like a final gavel. I didn't learn so I could get an A. She paused. I learned so we wouldn't get evicted again because I didn't understand what we were signing. A long silence followed. But it wasn't awkward. It was earned. The kind of silence that follows testimony, not commentary. Something raw, unpolished, but irrefutable. In the back row, the young black woman with the folded letter didn't move. But something in her posture shifted, just enough to say, yes, that's what I came here for. Her fingers tightened around the paper in her lap. She wasn't crying. She was bracing, as if the truth she had lived was finally being said out loud, and her body needed to hold still so she wouldn't fall apart. Jasmine didn't look at her. She didn't need to. She'd already spoken for her. Across the stage, Karoline's expression had changed. Her arms weren't folded anymore. Her posture wasn't relaxed, because this wasn't a debate now. This was exposure. Jasmine hadn't offered a defense. She had delivered a verdict, and somewhere in that moment, the balance of the room tilted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. But before the weight of Jasmine's story could truly land, before the silence could settle into the ribs of the room, Karoline leaned forward, her voice cold, clinical, and void of even the pretense of empathy. Sure, she said, her smile tight and sharp. That was moving. Her voice wasn't raised, but it cut through the air like it was designed to end conversations, not contribute to them. But being able to tell a sad story doesn't make someone a leader. It just makes them a survivor. She didn't blink as she delivered it, like someone used to winning not with facts, but with certainty. You say you pulled yourself out of something terrible. I don't doubt it. But if hardship was the path to greatness, then how do you explain the millions of people who went through hell and stayed there? The room tensed, not from disagreement, but discomfort. The kind of discomfort that comes when someone stops debating ideas and starts dismantling dignity. If we measured success by who suffered the most, Karoline continued, we'd be crowning every broke, unemployed person in this country with a medal. But that's not how the world works. Pain doesn't make you qualified. Perseverance isn't proof of leadership. It's just what people do when they don't have better options. A few people in the audience shifted in their seats. One man crossed his arms tighter. A woman in the third row glanced away. No one clapped. No one dared. Karoline didn't seem to notice, or didn't care. She was speaking for herself, and to the crowd she knew was watching from screens, not seats. She turned fully toward Jasmine now. The smile was gone, replaced with something far more unsettling, a quiet, deliberate challenge. Let's not confuse surviving with succeeding, she said, her tone flattening. You made it through some rough years, fine. But that doesn't mean you're fit to sit at the table where real decisions are made. There it was. Not an argument, not a response. A dismissal, wrapped in logic, delivered like a verdict. She wasn't criticizing Jasmine's background. She was disqualifying it. It was the kind of moment that didn't make headlines, but made scars. Karoline wasn't just challenging Jasmine's perspective. She was undermining her legitimacy, turning her life into a footnote, treating her resilience not as strength, but as a liability. In Karoline's eyes, Jasmine hadn't earned her seat. She had dragged herself there, and that was somehow less noble, less clean, less deserving. The camera operator instinctively zoomed in, not on Karoline, but on Jasmine. Not because she was speaking, but because she wasn't. She was sitting perfectly still, not frozen, but composed, trained, like someone who had endured far worse words in rooms with far less light. Jasmine didn't look away, didn't blink. Her hands rested loosely in her lap, but her jaw had set, not in anger, in recognition. Because this wasn't new. She had heard this before, in fancier rooms with bigger ceilings and more polished accents. She'd heard it from donors who called her raw and passionate, like those were dirty words. From board members who said, "You're impressive, but maybe not the right tone for national policy." From professors who told her, "People like you should speak more carefully. You don't want to come across as emotional." She'd memorized this move. This was what power did when it felt threatened. It reached for decorum like a weapon and used it to bury people alive. Karoline had just drawn a line through Jasmine's entire life and labeled it insufficient. And for a long, brutal moment, no one said a word. But not everyone was silent inside. In the back row, the young black student with the folded letter still hadn't moved. But something in her face had shifted. Her lips were pressed tight, her knuckles pale where they gripped the edges of that worn paper. She wasn't just watching anymore. She was bracing for the moment she'd seen play out too many times, when someone speaks truth and the world shrugs. But Jasmine didn't shrug. She didn't flinch. She didn't fall for the bait, because she knew. You don't respond to a scalpel with a scream. You wait until it cuts too deep, and then you show them what they hit. And even before Jasmine opened her mouth, the room knew. Karoline hadn't won anything. She had simply stepped onto a wire far thinner than she realized. And beneath it, the truth was waiting, burned in, unshakable, and ready. As Karoline's final words echoed in the sterile silence, and Jasmine sat like a storm wound tight inside stillness, the shift didn't come from the podium, but from the farthest seat in the room where no one had looked all night. She hadn't moved since the show began, not once. But now there was something different about her stillness, something sharpened. The young black student in the back row wasn't adjusting in her seat, wasn't reacting dramatically, but her presence had changed. Her eyes, fixed on Jasmine with unwavering intensity, had narrowed, not in confusion, but in recognition. Not of a talking point, of herself, of something buried and unsaid, now stirring under the weight of words that weren't meant for people like her to survive. Her breathing remained controlled, but there was a tightness to it, as if her ribs were bracing for impact she knew was coming. Slowly, deliberately, her right hand reached into the front pocket of her canvas bag. No one noticed. Not the host, not the panel, not the audience trained to watch the lights, the center, the power. But in her fingers, a worn piece of paper emerged, folded in thirds, yellowed slightly at the edges, the kind of fold that doesn't come from storage, but from being opened, closed, reconsidered, and kept. Her thumb ran over the crease once. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. She knew every word. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of something long carried and never spoken aloud. She placed the letter across her lap with quiet reverence, not like an object, like a vow. Camera 3 caught it, not through instruction, but instinct. The operator didn't zoom fast or frame it like a reveal. He just held the shot, because even through the glass, even from a distance, something in her posture said, "Pay attention, not to me, to what's about to happen." The rest of the room hadn't noticed yet, but the current had shifted. It wasn't in the arguments, it wasn't in the policy, it was in the air, in the silence that began to stretch. Just a little longer than it should have, long enough for truth to take root. This wasn't the kind of moment you script. It was the kind that had been waiting for someone to stop talking long enough for it to begin. The silence that followed Karoline's dismissal was brittle, ready to shatter. And when Jasmine finally spoke, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't defend herself. She changed the rules. "You think strength means never falling?" Jasmine said, her voice measured, quiet, but carrying a gravity that pulled the room to attention. "That's not strength. That's luck, or insulation, or both." She didn't blink. "Because if you've never been knocked down, it's not because you're strong, It's because someone kept the floor clean for you. Her gaze was locked, not in anger, but in certainty, a kind of emotional precision that made every word feel heavier. I've fallen. I've hit concrete. I've buried my head in a pillow so my little brother wouldn't hear me cry because the rent was late, and I didn't know what else to cut. It felt like Jasmine's final words had sealed the room in silence. But silence, it turned out, was only the beginning. From the very last row, a chair scraped against the floor, softly, but enough to cut through the stillness like a warning bell. No one spoke. No one moved. But all eyes turned. A young black woman, barely 19, shoulders square, hands steady, was now standing. She didn't ask permission. She didn't look for a microphone. She simply stepped into the aisle with a folded sheet of paper pressed flat against her chest, as if it was the only thing keeping her grounded. Her white blouse caught the light. Her shoes echoed lightly with each step. And though her face was calm, her eyes were locked forward with the intensity of someone who had waited a long time to be seen. Not noticed, but seen. She stopped 5 feet from the stage. Not quite in the spotlight, not quite in the dark. Her voice, when it came, was clear. Not loud, not forced. Just the kind of voice that only exists when truth has lived inside you too long. I wrote this letter to Representative Jasmine Crockett, she said, holding the paper in both hands, exactly 1 year ago this week. It was part of my college scholarship application, but really it was a letter I never thought anyone would hear. The room was silent, not just listening, but holding still, like the floor itself understood the weight of what was being said. I was 17, living in the back seat of a 2003 Ford Taurus with my mom. She worked nights at a storage facility. We parked behind gas stations, covered the windows with jackets, ate dinner from vending machines, or not at all. I didn't have Wi-Fi. I didn't have a desk. I studied by holding cereal boxes under streetlights. I memorized the multiplication table off the back of an old Raisin Bran box someone had thrown away. That was how I prepped for midterms. She swallowed once, but her voice didn't waver. I was told not to talk about any of that in my essay. A guidance counselor said it might make donors uncomfortable, that I should just focus on my goals. But then one night, I saw a video of Jasmine Crockett testifying in Congress. I didn't even know what the hearing was about. I just remember the way she spoke. She didn't clean it up. She didn't shrink herself. She didn't beg anyone to accept her. She looked directly at Jasmine now, not with admiration, but with quiet recognition. You look like my mom. You sounded like the women I knew, and you weren't apologizing for it. She unfolded the last part of the letter. The paper shook once in her hands, not from nerves, but from something deeper. The vulnerability of reading a sentence you once wrote alone, not knowing if it would ever matter. In that essay, she said, I quoted something you said at the end of a hearing. You said, "We don't overcome hardship to be admired. We overcome it so we never have to wait for someone to hand us value we already had." I copied that down in a notebook with a broken binding. That line made me rewrite my entire essay in one night. I told the truth. For the first time. I didn't hide my story. Her voice dropped lower, not in volume, but in gravity. And I got the scholarship, not because I made people comfortable, but because I finally stopped pretending I wasn't worth anything unless I did. She folded the letter slowly, precisely, the way you do when the words on the page have finally done their job. Then she looked at Jasmine again, this time with nothing left to prove. Thank you, she said simply. No tears, no bow, just truth. And then as calmly as she had come, she returned to her seat, leaving behind not applause, not debate, but something far heavier, proof that Jasmine hadn't just survived. She had lit a path for someone else to follow out of the dark. She returned to her seat in silence, but the echo of her words didn't stop there. They left the room with everyone present, and then somehow, with everyone who wasn't. The video appeared online just past midnight. No fanfare, no trending hashtags, no call to action. Just a quiet post from a nameless account. The title was plain, almost accidental. A student read a letter, and the room went silent. There was no logo, no intro, no opinion. It was exactly 3 minutes and 42 seconds of raw footage from camera 3, Handheld, slightly off-center, but steady enough to capture everything. A young woman standing in the aisle, a folded piece of paper in her hand, a voice that didn't tremble, a truth that did. There was no music swelling beneath her words, no digital effects, no edits to punch the moment. And yet people couldn't look away. The silence in the room, the breathless, heavy stillness that followed each sentence, somehow made it louder than any speech ever broadcast from a podium. It didn't trend. It didn't need to. The views rose like smoke, quietly, relentlessly. 1,000, then 10,000, then 100,000. No headline screamed, no influencer boosted. It passed from one person to another like a secret they were finally allowed to say out loud. The comment section was unlike anything the internet was used to. No arguments, no insults, just confessions. I watched this 3 times and still can't move. That line about the cereal box, I lived that. I never said it out loud until now. She didn't just read a letter. She gave us permission to tell the truth. One user wrote, "I used to believe I didn't belong in certain rooms. After this, I don't care if I'm invited. I'm walking in." And Jasmine, she didn't retweet the clip. She didn't post a statement. She didn't speak to the press. But her silence wasn't absence. It was presence. Because what the student had said, what she had done, wasn't about Jasmine the politician. It was about every girl who thought she had to hide her hunger behind good grammar. Every student who had memorized words they couldn't afford to write down. Every child who thought overcoming meant being quiet once you made it out. This wasn't a viral moment, it was a rupture. And no one saw it coming because it didn't arrive through power. It arrived through honesty, and it stayed. It didn't start with a trend or a headline. There were no hashtags, no morning show interviews. But in the quiet that followed, something began to shift. Not on screens, but in people. In a small public high school just outside Colorado Springs, the change began without announcement. Monday morning, the first bell rang like it always did, echoing down fluorescent-lit hallways. But when students entered their first period class, they didn't find a quiz on the board, no attendance check, no syllabus, just a single line written in dry erase marker across the front wall. Write a letter to the person who helped you stand when you didn't think you could. No one spoke at first. The room was unusually quiet, not the restless kind, but the kind you only hear before something personal. Some students stared at the blank page for 5 minutes straight. Others started writing instantly without looking up, as if the sentence had been sitting inside them for years. One girl asked if she could write too. A boy folded his letter 3 times and tucked it into his hoodie pocket before anyone saw. No one asked for spelling checks. No one tried to make their handwriting neater. These weren't assignments. They were truths finally invited out into the light. In another corner of the country, thousands of miles from that classroom, a retired Army sergeant sat alone at his kitchen table in Indiana, watching the video for the 3rd time on his phone. He didn't speak, just opened a drawer, pulled out a thin yellow envelope, and laid its contents carefully on the table. A letter, folded twice, frayed at the edges. The handwriting was crooked, the ink faded. It had been written in purple marker, by a hand too small to grip a pen properly. It said, "I'm sorry I failed my spelling test, but thank you for not being mad. I'll do better next time. Love, your daughter." The letter was 17 years old. He'd kept it in his wallet until the corners fell apart. That morning, he placed it into a new envelope and drove across town to his daughter's house. She was 30 now, married, with a child of her own. She opened the letter, confused at first. Then she cried for a reason she couldn't explain. Not just because of the words she had forgotten, but because her father never had. He posted a photo that night, just his hand, holding the old note. No caption but this: "I gave it back to her today. She forgot writing it. I never did." There was no call to action, no campaign, just people rediscovering pieces of themselves they thought had been erased. It wasn't about Jasmine. It wasn't even about the student anymore. It was about what they unlocked: a quiet reckoning, a nationwide pause, a gentle but unrelenting question rising in kitchens, in classrooms, in nursing homes and train stations. Who helped me stand? And why have I never told them? Because for the first time in a long time, people weren't just remembering their pain. They were remembering who held them when it broke and how much those hands still mattered. As the ripples spread across classrooms, living rooms, inboxes, and late-night text threads, one question echoed louder than any soundbite. Where was Jasmine Crockett? She hadn't spoken. Not once. Not on air, not on social media, not even in the friendly corners of quiet podcasts that once embraced her voice. She declined every invitation, turned down every cable panel, and walked past every microphone extended in her path. For 3 straight days, her team sent no statements, no acknowledgments, nothing. And in Washington, D.C., a place where silence is often mistaken for weakness, that nothing felt louder than a scandal. Producers speculated, editors waited. Twitter accounts posted screenshots of her last online activity, desperate for a narrative thread. Talking heads on political roundtables filled airtime asking, is she pulling back? Is this a calculated rebrand? A strategic pivot? But the people who needed to hear her weren't asking any of those questions, because those people weren't watching cable news. They were rewatching a student reading a letter. Outside her Capitol Hill office, cameras were posted for 48 hours straight. One intern opened a side door on the second day to bring in boxed lunches, and even that became a trending clip. Inside, the phones rang nonstop, not with criticism, but with confessions, messages, people leaving voicemails they didn't know they needed to leave. I just wanted to say, thank you. I haven't spoken to my father in 11 years. I sent him my letter today. My daughter saw the clip and asked if we could write one together. She's 10. I didn't know she felt that way about me. None of this came from hashtags. None of it was amplified by influencers. It wasn't a movement designed in boardrooms or coordinated by strategists. It was just the aftershock of truth that had been too long contained. And Jasmine, she said nothing. Not because she didn't care, not because she was above it, but because she understood something rare. When a moment becomes bigger than the person who sparked it, speaking again too soon is not leadership, it's ego. And ego was never the engine that drove her through law school on secondhand textbooks, or through campaigns without corporate donors, or through courtrooms where she was told she was too emotional to be trusted with fact. She wasn't performing silence. She was protecting something sacred. By the 4th day, the tension among journalists began to bend toward impatience. Some op-eds accused her of ghosting the public. Others claimed she was manipulating sentiment. One editorial in a conservative outlet accused her of weaponizing poverty for political optics, a line written by someone who had clearly never been hungry long enough to memorize numbers off the back of a cereal box. Still, she didn't respond. No tweet, no filter, not even a post of the letter, which by then had already been printed out and tacked to bulletin boards in schools across the country. Then late Thursday evening, the email arrived. It wasn't addressed to the media. It wasn't sent to verified press contacts or announced through an official briefing. It came from a generic house.gov address with no subject line, no header, no logo, and no attachments. Just 29 words, unformatted, unstyled, but undeniable. I don't need to be remembered. I just need someone, somewhere, someday, to feel strong enough to ask for help and not feel ashamed for doing it. No follow-up, no clarification, no second draft, and somehow that one sentence hit harder than 1,000 press releases ever could. It wasn't humble, it wasn't even soft, it was defiant in its honesty. Because in a world that teaches you to brand your struggle, polish your survival, and monetize your testimony, Jasmine refused. She didn't ask to be celebrated. She asked that someone, anyone, feel less alone. And across the country, people heard her. A high school counselor in Phoenix printed that line and taped it to the door of her office. She didn't tell her students why. She didn't have to. One boy asked to stay after school for the first time in weeks. A girl who never spoke raised her hand in class. In a family therapist's office in rural Kentucky, the quote was printed in 18-point font and placed in the waiting room. By Friday, 5 patients had circled it with a pen. One left a sticky note underneath. I've needed help since 1997. Today, I said it out loud. At a university in New Jersey, a professor read the line to a lecture hall of exhausted seniors who were drowning in final papers and quietly wondering whether they belonged at all. One student stood up and walked out, not in protest, but to call her mother for the first time since they fought 3 months earlier. In these corners, unseen, unmeasured, unmonetized, Jasmine's words were doing something no algorithm could predict. They were giving people permission, permission to be human, to not know, to ask, to speak without shame, to hurt out loud and still belong. No viral trend was attached, no fundraisers followed, because this wasn't a campaign. This was what truth feels like when it's unbranded, unfiltered, and given away with nothing expected in return. And Jasmine? She went back to work. Back to the hearings that don't get live streamed. Back to casework for families no one writes headlines about. Back to the quiet corners of a broken system where the cameras don't go. But the pain still lives. She didn't walk back into the spotlight. She walked past it, quietly, deliberately, because her work had never been about claiming space. It had always been about making space for others. And if someone, somewhere, someday felt strong enough to raise their hand and ask for help, without apology, without fear, then that one sentence was more than enough. She never needed to be remembered. She just needed someone to believe they were worth remembering themselves. And while Jasmine disappeared from the cameras with purpose, the one who had stood opposite her, sharp, polished, unbending, stepped back onto the stage, unaware that the rules had changed. Karoline Leavitt hadn't been canceled. Her inbox wasn't flooded with threats. Her donors didn't vanish. No petitions were launched, no boycotts announced. She hadn't said anything outrageous enough to provoke national condemnation, at least not by the standards of a media ecosystem trained to reward cruelty dressed as conviction. The headlines moved on. The clip of her performance in Face the Divide was cut, re-uploaded, edited for context, debated online, and then buried under newer controversies. She weathered it like she always did, because Karoline was made for storms, ones she expected, controlled, even invited. But what she didn't expect was what came next. A week later, at a packed auditorium in Des Moines, she stood behind the podium under bright, flattering light, ready to deliver the same tight message she'd practiced for years. Discipline, self-reliance, individual strength. The script was the same. The crowd was familiar. And when the first round of applause rang out as she stepped on stage, she smiled. The air smelled of confidence, of control, of normalcy. But when the Q&A session began, something cracked. A woman in the second row, a school principal with a laminated badge still clipped to her collar, raised her hand and skipped the microphone. "I don't want to know where you went to college," she said. "I want to know who picked you up when you fell." Karoline blinked, just once. She tilted her head slightly, buying time. The crowd didn't laugh, didn't murmur. They waited. Another hand, a younger man in the back, sleeves rolled up. "Not your policies," he said. "Your pain. When you got knocked flat, who showed up?" The questions kept coming. Not hostile, not disrespectful, but different. Not the kind of questions she had prepared bullet points for. They weren't asking for her qualifications. They were asking for her scars. And Karoline had spent a lifetime making sure no one could see those. She smiled again, mechanical this time, deflecting. "We all go through hard things," she said, "but I believe in rising above them, not leaning on others." The words landed, but they didn't settle. Something in the room stayed taut, like a string pulled too tight. A third voice, this time from a teenager sitting with a youth delegation. "Did you ever write a letter to someone who helped you?" he asked. "Even if they didn't know they did?" Karoline's smile dropped for a split second. Not enough for the cameras, but enough for the people watching closely. Because it wasn't an attack, it was a mirror. They weren't trying to shame her. They were trying to reach her. But Karoline didn't know how to stand in that kind of spotlight, the one that asked for vulnerability, not volume. She knew how to debate, how to win, how to out-talk. But this wasn't a contest. It was a reckoning, and it was quiet. The applause at the end of her speech was polite, respectful, but thinner than before. People weren't walking out angry. They were walking out thinking. And for someone like Caroline, whose power had always been in owning the narrative, that kind of silence was unfamiliar, unsettling. Backstage, a staffer asked if she was okay. She nodded, but her hands stayed clenched for too long, because for the first time, she realized something that couldn't be unrealized. Credentials were no longer the currency. The room was no longer buying polish. They were buying proof. And the question she'd never had to answer, who picked you up, was the only one people cared about now. She hadn't been canceled. She had been rewritten, not by outrage, but by a quiet letter read by a girl with nothing to sell and everything to remember. And Caroline couldn't stop it, because the echo didn't belong to her. It never had. By then, the headlines had moved on, the debate had cooled, and the cameras had followed noise elsewhere. But what remained wasn't a sound. It was an image. It started with a photo. No one knew who took it or where it was taken. It didn't come from a journalist or a campaign aide. It wasn't professionally edited. There was no watermark, no branding, just a quiet upload to an obscure student discussion board, the kind of corner of the internet that rarely draws attention until it does. No faces, no filters. Just a desk, the pale light of early morning falling across the scratched wood. A folded letter, creased, worn, familiar, rested gently next to a wide ruled student notebook, its spiral edges slightly warped from use. There were no bright colors, no dramatic angle. But what caught the eye, what stopped thousands cold, was the line of pencil, written lightly but with unmistakable finality, across the top page of that notebook. Today I wrote a letter to myself. I'm not ashamed anymore. 9 words, barely a whisper, but something in their simplicity cut through the noise louder than any headline. The photo didn't go viral in the traditional sense. It didn't surge with likes or trend with hashtags. It didn't need to. It was passed by hand, one inbox to another, from teacher to student, friend to friend, a quiet chain reaction across communities that didn't need commentary to understand what they were seeing. Because people knew. They knew what it meant to sit in silence, afraid to say what you really needed. They knew what it meant to bury your own story to make others comfortable. They knew what it meant to carry shame that was never yours to begin with. And for those people, for the quiet ones, the tired ones, the ones who never raised their hand because they didn't want to be called on, the photo was a signal fire. Not a scream, not a demand, but a hand held out from the dark. Underneath the photo, someone left a comment. No name, no bio, no emojis, just a single sentence, written like a confession. Real education begins the moment someone is brave enough to ask, "Do you understand?" and stays long enough to hear the answer, instead of pretending they didn't ask. There was no argument beneath that post, no quote wars, no trolling, just silence, that rarest kind of silence online, the kind that comes when people feel, not react. In one classroom in Kansas, a teacher printed the photo and pinned it to the back wall, quietly replacing the laminated "Work Hard, Dream Big" poster that had collected dust for years. No one commented on the change, but 3 students stayed after class that week, not to ask for help on a test, but just to sit. One of them finally said, "I think I've been pretending I understand since 7th grade." The teacher didn't respond with a lesson. She just pulled up a chair and said, "Tell me where you got lost." In a juvenile detention center in Maryland, a counselor showed the image during group therapy. One boy stared at it for 10 full minutes before saying, "I never thought I could write to myself like that." The next day, they started a project called Letters We Owe Ourselves. Some wrote to their younger selves. Some wrote to their future. Some couldn't finish. But they all started. In a nursing home in Mississippi, an aide printed the photo and left it on the front desk. 2 days later, a 76-year-old retired English teacher quietly asked for a notebook. She hadn't written a letter in over 40 years. It wasn't just circulating, it was unlocking. Because this moment, this quiet revolution, sparked by a student's folded letter and a congresswoman who refused to shout back, was never about winning a debate. It was about something more enduring, more dangerous to the world that rewards polish over truth. It was about telling people that asking doesn't mean you're broken, that not knowing doesn't make you small, That help isn't weakness, it's survival. And the notebook, the one in the photo, became more than a symbol. It became a blueprint. One teacher in Oregon rewrote her entire curriculum around it. The first page of every student's binder was no longer labeled with objectives or goals. It simply asked, "Who would you be if you didn't have to prove anything today?" In an East LA middle school, a girl taped the image to her locker door. When asked why, she shrugged and said, "It reminds me I'm allowed to start over." In a city hall in Minneapolis, a staffer printed the comment beneath the photo and taped it to the water cooler. "Do you understand?" Not just as a question, but as a dare to pause, a dare to stay, a dare to listen. Because for years, decades, entire systems had been built on the idea that if someone doesn't speak up, they must be fine. That silence meant consent. That struggle meant failure. And here, on one torn page and one sentence written in pencil, was proof that people had only stayed silent because no one ever waited long enough to hear them. This wasn't a policy shift. This wasn't a vote. This was a mirror. And in that mirror, thousands saw themselves for the first time, not as liabilities, not as gaps to be filled, but as voices that never should have been ignored in the first place. And the girl who wrote that note, no one knew her name, but her words were now etched in classrooms, therapist offices, break rooms, church bulletins, and prison rec rooms. Because she didn't write them to be quoted. She wrote them to finally tell herself the truth. And somehow that truth made room for everyone else. No one clapped, no one shouted, no one filmed it. But something in the country shifted, not from volume, but from stillness with weight. Because when someone writes, "I'm not ashamed anymore," and means it, there is nothing left for shame to hold on to. And for the first time in a very long time, that was enough. The photo faded from timelines. The show's set was dismantled, and the microphones went cold. But the lesson didn't leave with them. It stayed. In notebooks, in breath, in bones. This wasn't just a viral moment. It wasn't a trending soundbite or a flash of sympathy. It was something far rarer, something deeper. The kind of moment that doesn't pass, it lodges. Beneath the headlines, beyond the metrics, something unspoken and ancient had surfaced. And for those who had carried silence like a second skin, that moment had a weight they'd never forget. Because what happened in that studio didn't just challenge a debate, it challenged a belief system, a hierarchy, an inherited lie. The lie that some people are born understanding. The lie that leadership only belongs to the polished. The lie that dignity must be earned in perfect grammar and uninterrupted confidence. The lie that the ones who ask for help are the ones least likely to lead. Jasmine Crockett didn't dismantle those lies by shouting them down. She dismantled them by surviving them. And that was the difference. She didn't make the audience feel sorry for her. She made them feel seen. She made them confront the question no one ever asks on a resume. No one teaches in a prep school. No one includes in a campaign ad. When you were on the ground, who lifted you? That was the crack in the armor. That was the breach in the wall. Because people realized, some of them for the first time, that the systems we call merit were never built to measure humanity. They were built to reward performance. And Jasmine didn't perform. She confessed. She testified. She told the truth with no makeup, no fanfare, no defense. And in doing so, she gave others permission to tell theirs. But that permission came at a cost. Because the truth is, Jasmine shouldn't have had to carry the burden of being both advocate and example. She shouldn't have had to relive hunger and humiliation just to be allowed a voice at the table. She shouldn't have had to bleed in public so that others could be considered fully human. That's the injustice at the heart of it. That's what makes the lesson land like a slow, clenched punch. Why does dignity have to be proven in pain? Why do the unheard always have to narrate their suffering for the world to care? No one asked Karoline Leavitt how many times she cried herself to sleep. No one needed to see her utility bill to decide if she deserved to speak. But Jasmine had to walk through every room like a courtroom, her life on trial, her tone under surveillance, her intelligence up for cross-examination, just to be heard without mockery. And still, she didn't retaliate. She didn't humiliate. She didn't weaponize her rage. She just stood there, unapologetically whole, unapologetically flawed, unapologetically present, and told a story most people only whisper to themselves. That's the lesson. That's the revolution. Not in burning systems down, but in holding space inside them. Space for brokenness, for late bloomers, for those still learning. Because somewhere along the way, we mistook intelligence for fluency. We mistook strength for silence. We mistook leadership for polish. And then a student, barely 19, sitting in the last row, rose without permission and rewrote the script. Not with power, but with paper. With a folded letter held in trembling hands that somehow never shook when she spoke. She didn't quote legislation. She didn't list degrees. She said she used to memorize multiplication tables off cereal boxes. She said she slept in a car. And she said she wasn't ashamed anymore. And that, more than any bill, any policy, any viral clip, is where the world changed. Because somewhere, someone saw themselves in her. Someone who had hidden their poverty. Someone who had smiled through food insecurity. Someone who had nodded even when they didn't understand the question. And now they knew they weren't alone. The human lesson wasn't about Jasmine. It wasn't even about the student. It was about us. All of us. How many times we've stayed quiet when we didn't know the answer? How many times we've clapped for speakers who never asked if we understood them? How many times we've mistaken confusion for failure instead of seeing it as the beginning of learning? We live in a world that teaches us to perform competence instead of cultivating comprehension. We celebrate the loudest, the quickest, the most polished, without ever asking who's still in the back of the room, scared to raise their hand. And so the lesson lives here. Education is not the possession of the prepared. It is the courage of the curious. And humanity doesn't start when you have the answers. It starts when you dare to ask the question out loud. Do you understand? And stay long enough to hear, no. That's what Jasmine did. She stayed. She stood. She let her silence speak when the moment needed silence. She let her scars testify when the room demanded proof. And she let someone else finish the story. A student, no podium, no microphone, no power, but truth. That is the legacy. Not political, not procedural, human. Because at the end of all the shouting, all the debating, all the polished lines and prepped sound bites, the question that echoes most isn't, did you win? It's, who did you make feel like they finally belonged in the room? That is the fire Jasmine lit, and no amount of silence will ever put it out. The silence changed us, but change doesn't mean anything unless it becomes action. Not just out there, but in here. Not for someone else, for you. This moment, this shift, doesn't belong to Jasmine Crockett. It doesn't belong to the student who stood. It belongs to everyone who's ever stayed quiet when they knew the answer. Everyone who's ever whispered, I don't get it to themselves, but nodded like they did anyway. Everyone who's ever passed a test they didn't understand just to avoid looking slow. This moment belongs to you. So here's where it begins. Not with noise, not with fury, but with paper. Write a letter. Not the kind you post for likes, not the kind that performs. A letter. To the version of you who learned to shrink, to the moment you stopped asking, to the child who knew what it felt like to be embarrassed for not knowing what the others did, the one who sat through the lesson pretending to take notes while your stomach clenched, the one who started every answer with, I could be wrong, but just to brace for the blow. Write to that person, not to scold, to forgive. Tell them they were doing the best they could. Tell them that silence was a survival tactic, not a weakness. Tell them you're proud they stayed. Tell them it's okay now. You don't have to earn your right to speak. Then take another piece of paper. Write to someone who lifted you, not with a lecture, but with a pause. Not with praise, but with presence. Maybe it was a teacher, a grandmother, a stranger. Maybe they held your hand without knowing what they were holding. Maybe they said, that doesn't make you stupid, at the exact moment you needed to hear it. Maybe they just didn't walk away. Tell them, write it out. You don't need a perfect memory to thank them, just honesty, because this isn't about going viral. This is about becoming real, in your voice, in your time, in your own way. If you're a teacher, this is your moment to reframe everything. Start the next lesson with no content, just this question. What's one thing you've pretended to know that you didn't? Then wait. Don't fill the silence. Let the room breathe. Because education isn't about how fast you get to the answer. It's about whether people feel safe enough to say they're still searching. If you're a parent, pause. Tonight at dinner, ask your child, what's something you don't understand that you're afraid to say out loud? Then listen, not to fix it, just to hear it. And if they don't answer, say, you don't have to be perfect to talk to me. If you lead a team, a classroom, a congregation, a household, use your power to slow the world down long enough to notice who's falling behind. And when they do, don't judge their pace. Sit beside them. Because people don't fail because they're dumb. People fail because they get tired of pretending. And most of the world never even stops long enough to ask why someone is falling behind. Jasmine Crockett did, and so did that student. They didn't ask for applause. They asked for honesty. They didn't ask to be right. They asked to be understood. That's what you can do now, not tomorrow. Now think of someone who has disappeared in silence. The kid in the back who never raised their hand. The colleague who never speaks up during meetings. The friend who shrinks in conversations full of acronyms. Reach out. Don't say what's wrong. Say, have you ever been asked a question and not understood it, but were too afraid to say so? Let that be your opening. Then stay. Don't explain away their silence. Don't rush to translate. Sit in it with them, because the world teaches us that value is in volume. But that's a lie. Value is in vulnerability. Value is in the courage it takes to say, I didn't get it the first time, or the second, but I still want to learn. You don't have to be Jasmine to make someone feel heard. You don't have to be that student to make someone believe they're enough. You just have to show up differently and show someone else that knowledge is a bridge, not a border. If you're the one who's been silent the longest, if you're the one who still thinks your questions are interruptions, this is your invitation. You are not broken for needing more time. You are not stupid because you weren't taught the way others were. You are not alone. The most dangerous lie this world ever told is that success must be earned in silence. The truth is, silence was never consent. It was exhaustion. It was fear. It was the learned habit of disappearing before someone could tell you you didn't belong. Not anymore. Because now you know you are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to say, I'm still learning. You are allowed to start again. You are allowed to ask, will you stay while I figure this out? And if no one else will, I will. We will. Because this moment wasn't for the powerful. It was for the ones who survived long enough to speak. And now the only thing left to do is make room for more of them. So write the letter, send the message, ask the question, give someone else the mic. And if they tremble, stay anyway. Because that's what this whole story was trying to teach us all along. The most revolutionary thing we can do is listen long enough for someone to feel safe saying, no, I don't understand, and stay until they do. That's your cue, not to be Jasmine, to be yourself, with your voice, your past, your questions, your courage, to stand in your truth like that student stood in the aisle, and to say, I'm not ashamed anymore. I'm ready to understand, and I'm ready to help others understand too. Now go, make the world quieter, so the voices that were once invisible can finally be heard. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. On the cold marble floor of Capitol Hill, Jasmine Crockett locks eyes with Kash Patel as the world watches. She has just received a top-secret memo proving he manipulated national intelligence for a hidden political deal. He thought she'd stay silent. He thought no one would dare confront him. But when she speaks, one question cuts through the chamber like a blade. How many soldiers died because of your lies? What happens next turns a routine hearing into a national reckoning and forces America to ask, if she hadn't spoken, would we ever have known the truth? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Capitol Hill, 11:43 p.m. The building was almost empty. The usual noise, footsteps, phones ringing, doors opening, had faded hours ago. Now there was only silence, broken by the soft hum of lights and the quiet tapping of rain on the windows. Inside her office, Jasmine Crockett sat alone. Her desk was cluttered with files and reports, but her eyes were fixed on one thing, a thick folder that had arrived just minutes earlier in an unmarked envelope. The message on her burner phone was simple. Package delivered. You're the last line. It came from someone she hadn't heard from in over a year, a former intelligence officer who had disappeared without warning. Jasmine knew right away. This was not just another late-night document dump. Something about it felt different, urgent, dangerous. She opened the folder with steady hands. Inside were 68 pages stamped, restricted for clearance level 5 only. These were not rumors or opinions. They were internal memos, direct quotes, meeting logs, all pointing to one man, Kash Patel. The documents revealed a clear pattern. Patel had ordered several intelligence analysts to revise their threat assessments. Reports about cyber attacks from foreign actors were edited to look less serious. Mentions of specific countries and targets were removed entirely, and nowhere in the paperwork was there any record of oversight or legal review. It was manipulation, cold, calculated, and real. Jasmine leaned back in her chair. The weight of what she just read hit her like a wave. These weren't just edits. These were lies presented as fact. Lies that may have shaped national policy, military movements, even foreign relations. If this was true, then thousands of people had been misled. Soldiers, diplomats, voters, everyone. And no one had ever been held responsible. She stood and walked to the tall window, looking out over the dark city. The rain had started to fall harder now, leaving streaks on the glass. She saw her own reflection, tired, focused, not afraid. She thought about the people who had trusted her to speak for them, the veterans, the single mothers, the students working 2 jobs. She thought about the young man she'd met last month whose brother never came home from deployment, his death blamed on unexpected resistance that maybe should have been predicted. And then she thought of Patel, still smiling on television, still being praised by people who had no idea what he'd done behind closed doors. She turned back to the folder. She picked up her phone, opened her voice recorder, and pressed the red button. Her voice was low, steady. They count on our silence. Then she closed the folder, placed her hand on top of it, and said aloud, like a promise to herself and to the country, "If I stay quiet, I'm no better than him." The clock hit midnight, and in that moment, Jasmine Crockett made a decision that would change everything. The moment the clock struck midnight, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just prepared, she was armed with the truth. By the time the sun rose over Capitol Hill, she would either stand alone in the fire or bring the whole building down with her. The hearing room was already filled when Jasmine arrived, not just with people, but with pressure, thick, heavy, almost physical. The kind of tension that made even experienced staffers keep their voices low and their backs straight. Dozens of reporters crowded the back rows, their eyes trained on the seats in front, waiting for a spark. Cameras were mounted along every wall, blinking red and ready to broadcast the smallest flicker of drama to millions across the country. This wasn't just a policy debate, it was a battlefield, and everyone knew the 2 names it had been built for: Crockett versus Patel. Kash Patel entered exactly at 9 a.m., walking with a smooth confidence that bordered on arrogance. His suit was perfectly tailored, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, and his smirk, familiar from television appearances, widened with every step he took. He paused just long enough at the witness table to let the cameras get a clean shot, then took his seat like he had already won. He nodded to the chair, leaned back in his chair, and waited for the show to begin. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett was already seated. She hadn't spoken. She didn't need to. Her presence alone shifted the energy of the room. In front of her was a thick folder, 68 pages of classified material that didn't just raise questions, it exposed answers. Written in bold red ink across the cover were 3 words: for the people. She kept one hand resting lightly on the folder, the other on the nameplate in front of her. Her posture was upright but grounded, like someone who knew exactly what storm she was about to walk into and wasn't planning to blink. The chairman, a Republican known for his balanced stance and careful tone, gavelled the hearing to order. His opening remarks were formal, scripted, and deliberately bland, about bipartisan oversight and the need for transparency. But even he knew the room wasn't there for process. They were waiting for the break in the surface, the crack, the first real blow. Jasmine listened without expression, her eyes focused not on the chairman, not even on Patel, but on the clock behind them. She was measuring time, measuring silence. Then, with no warning, she leaned forward and spoke. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't shake. It cut straight through the air, clean, controlled, and deeply intentional. Mr. Patel, do you remember what you said in the secure briefing room on June 17th, 2022? The room stopped breathing. A few heads turned, unsure if they'd heard correctly. Reporters froze mid-keystroke. Patel's expression flickered, barely, but enough to catch on camera. He sat up straighter, lips tightening just slightly as if searching for the right expression to hide behind. It wasn't on his prep sheet. It wasn't in the talking points. Jasmine hadn't just gone off script. She had just lit the fuse. She didn't smile. She didn't repeat herself. She simply locked eyes with him, still and direct, her fingers now resting on the edge of the folder, as if it were a switch that could flip the entire hearing upside down. And in that silence, everyone in the room felt it. Not just the weight of the question, but the shift in power. This wasn't a hearing anymore. This was the beginning of a reckoning. The silence after Jasmine's question wasn't empty, it was loaded. Everyone in the room felt it. This wasn't just a hearing anymore. This was the moment something broke. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. With steady hands, she reached into her briefcase and pulled out a small black device. Unmarked, no brand, cold to the touch. It looked almost ordinary, like a power bank, but everyone watching could feel it wasn't. She set it on the desk in front of her, thumbed the biometric scanner, and watched the soft green light flicker to life. Then she spoke, not to Patel, but to the chairman. "I have a recording," she said simply, "previously unreleased. The voice on it belongs to Mr. Patel." The room froze. A few heads turned. Someone in the back dropped a pen, and it rolled against the marble floor with a soft clink. Jasmine connected the device to the chamber's audio system and nodded toward the technician. "Play it." A low hiss came through the speakers, then silence, then a voice, clear, recognizable, without distortion. "Real intelligence will cause panic. I need them quiet. We don't need panic. We need control." It wasn't a guess. It wasn't edited. It was Kash Patel, in his own words, giving an order that could rewrite history. The room didn't react right away, almost as if it couldn't. Then the air changed. Reporters glanced at one another. Committee members leaned forward in their seats. It wasn't outrage yet. It was something deeper, realization. This wasn't political anymore. It was personal. It was institutional. The chairman's voice cut through the heavy quiet, calm but urgent. "Representative Crockett, do you have a means of verifying the source and authenticity of that file?" Jasmine nodded and produced a second device, a slim, silver module that lit up instantly on touch. The screen displayed a clear digital chain of custody: dates, locations, access codes, and most importantly, fingerprints. Her fingerprints, the whistleblower's, and metadata from the original meeting room. Jasmine handed it to the clerk. "It's fully traceable, unaltered, time-stamped and stored in an encrypted federal archive." She didn't blink. She didn't shift. She knew exactly what she was holding. Patel, until then silent, jolted forward in his seat. His jaw clenched, voice raised, not in confidence, but in desperation. "This is a setup. I don't confirm that recording is real. Anyone can fake audio these days." His words spilled fast, rushed, as though trying to outrun the weight of what had already landed. His fingers gripped the edge of the table. His knee bounced slightly, uncontrolled. He wasn't answering. He was unraveling. Jasmine didn't react. She waited. Then after a beat, she spoke. Quiet but sharp, like a steel needle through fabric. You don't need to confirm it, Mr. Patel. The truth confirms itself. That was the moment the room changed for good. Her voice carried across the marble walls, not with volume, but with conviction. She wasn't trying to win the room. She was speaking directly to the people watching beyond it. Those at home, those who had doubted, those who had waited too long for someone to stand up and say what needed to be said. And now it had been said. The truth didn't ask for permission. It didn't beg for approval. It simply stood and made liars sit down. The words, "the truth confirms itself," had barely settled when Jasmine, with the composure of someone who had waited months for this moment, struck again, not louder but deeper. This wasn't escalation. This was exposure. "I'd like to call a witness," she said, not as a request but as a quiet declaration. The room tensed, not in confusion, but in instinct. Everyone, from staffers to senators, knew that when surprises happened during a congressional hearing, they were either political theater or nuclear-grade truth. And Jasmine didn't do theater. The chairman hesitated, unsure whether to object. But one look at her, calm, unblinking, made him simply nod. From the far-left entrance, two federal officers stepped into the chamber, walking with a sense of gravity that shifted the entire room. Between them was a person in a gray tailored suit, posture rigid, hands folded in front, face half covered by a matte black identity mask. It wasn't dramatic, it was protocol, and the effect was chilling. This wasn't just a whistleblower. This was someone who had been silenced and protected. The witness sat down carefully, adjusting the microphone like they had rehearsed it 100 times alone in a hotel room under an alias. Every movement was precise, controlled, but not out of confidence, out of survival. The chairman, still catching up, cleared his throat. "Please state your name and role for the record." "I cannot state my name publicly. I am appearing today under the protections afforded by the federal whistleblower statute," the voice said, mechanically at first, but unmistakably human. It was a voice carrying the weight of months of silence. "I served as a Level 3 intelligence analyst at the CIA from 2017 until August 2022. I was part of the interagency team that developed threat assessments on foreign cyber operations targeting critical U.S. infrastructure, including water, energy, and communication systems." The room grew still. Jasmine didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. The truth was starting to unspool on its own. "In March 2022, I was directed to submit preliminary drafts of 2 reports for internal review. Both drafts indicated increased foreign activity targeting our grid systems, activity that, if not addressed, posed a real and imminent risk. I submitted the drafts along with source documentation. Days later, I was called into a secure meeting with Mr. Patel and 2 other senior officials. Mr. Patel reviewed the documents and stated directly, "This kind of language will create panic. Adjust it. Focus on resilience, not exposure." The witness's hand trembled slightly as they reached for a glass of water, took a slow sip, and continued. "I told him I would not alter verified intelligence to fit a political strategy. The next day I was reassigned to a non-operational desk role with no clearance access. My badge was flagged for internal review. Within a week, my access to the CIA network was cut entirely, and my career was effectively ended." They took a breath, not for effect, but out of necessity. But it didn't stop there. That sentence sent a wave through the chamber. Some leaned forward. Patel's jaw flexed slightly. His fingers had stopped tapping. 3 weeks later, someone accessed my personnel file and redacted portions of my clearance evaluation. A week after that, my spouse received 2 anonymous emails containing personal details from my file that had never been public. Threats, photos, times of day when we leave the house. It was clear I was being warned. Jasmine leaned forward slightly, voice low, almost like she was speaking to one person. "Do you have documentation to support that chain of events?" The witness nodded. "I've provided this committee with full copies of my original reports, metadata records, internal emails, and security incident logs. All traceable, all time-stamped." Then slowly they placed a thin drive on the table. "That includes the original language I submitted and the altered version Mr. Patel signed." Jasmine turned toward the AV technician. "Bring up the footage." The chamber lights dimmed slightly as the screen behind the witness table blinked to life. The video was from an internal security camera. No audio, just a grainy but steady image of Patel standing inside a secure federal briefing room, time-stamped May 3rd, 2022. He was flipping through a stack of papers, two different versions of the same report laid side by side. One bore a visible stamp, original, unmodified. The other, final, cleared for release. The changes were obvious even without the words. Redacted paragraphs, margin notes, entire pages missing. Patel looked down at the second version, paused, then signed his name in slow, deliberate strokes. There was no sound in the room, not from the audience, not from the chairman, not even from Patel. The video cut to black. Then the screen held a single still image. Patel's signature, just below a line that read, "Final intelligence clearance for interagency distribution." No one spoke. Jasmine didn't have to say anything. She didn't stand. She didn't smile. She simply folded her hands and waited. For the room, for the silence, for the weight of the evidence to do what it had to do. And in that silence, every person watching knew what they had just seen. A government official didn't just manipulate intelligence, he destroyed the integrity of an entire system, and someone had risked everything to prove it. But as the truth settled like dust over the room, the man at the center of it all didn't retreat. Instead, he reached for the oldest weapon in the book. Deflection through insult. Patel sat up straight, his face flushed with something between fury and humiliation. The video had cornered him, and he knew it. But instead of defending the evidence, he leaned into the microphone, forcing a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "This is all very dramatic," he said, scanning the committee, "and very on brand. You've got a narrative and he jabbed a finger toward Jasmine, plays her part well. The fearless outsider, the underdog, the crusader for justice. Except we all know what this really is." He paused for effect, letting the silence fill with tension, then delivered the line like a punch. "You've made a career out of weaponizing your skin color and your background. You're not fighting for truth, Representative. You're performing. For your base, for the cameras, for the headlines." A collective gasp broke through the chamber. Quiet, stunned, sharp. Reporters looked up from their laptops. Aides froze. Even the chairman's pen stopped mid-stroke. It wasn't just what Patel had said. It was the casual venom behind it. As if the truth she had just exposed could be dismissed by painting her as an opportunist. As if her intelligence, her preparation, her restraint meant nothing because of where she came from and how she looked. Jasmine didn't respond immediately. She didn't need to. The blow had landed, but it hadn't shaken her. If anything, it clarified the stakes. Because what Patel had just done wasn't just personal, it was systemic. He wasn't defending himself. He was trying to put her back in her place, and the room knew it. Everyone did. Patel's attack wasn't just a deflection. It was a calculated wound, aimed at the foundation of who Jasmine was. But it didn't crush her. It clarified her. Jasmine didn't answer right away. She sat still, stone still, as if measuring the exact shape of the disrespect thrown her way. Around her, the hearing room hung in an electric stillness, tight with discomfort, thick with tension. Patel's words had been like a toxin released in the air, subtle in delivery, but potent in intent. He hadn't just questioned her credentials. He had tried to erase the cost of her presence, to reduce her story to a stunt. The worst part wasn't that he said it. It was that he'd said it like he'd said it before, in rooms like this, to people like her, and gotten away with it. But this wasn't one of those rooms, and she wasn't one of those people. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even lean forward. Her hands remained clasped in front of her, steady, strong. Her voice, when it came, was deliberate, low, clear. "You're right," she said. "I do come from the streets. Not as an apology, not as a confession, as a declaration." Each word stood on its own, like a brick being laid in stone. "I come from places where sirens are lullabies and ambition is seen as betrayal. Where classrooms are overcrowded and courtrooms are never empty. Where people survive more systems than they ever escape." She paused, not to gather herself, but to give the truth room to breathe. And I never once denied it. I didn't rewrite my story to make you comfortable. I brought it here, into this room, into this hearing, because this building doesn't just belong to the polished and the pedigreed. It belongs to the people, all of them, especially the ones you're hoping will never feel invited inside. The weight of her voice filled every corner of the chamber. Patel shifted slightly, but she didn't look at him yet. She was still speaking to the system. I don't have the right connections. I didn't clerk for powerful judges or ride in on a legacy. What I have is what you can't fake, lived experience. What I bring into this chamber is not a performance. It's a record. It's a history, one that people like you keep trying to edit out. Then finally she turned and looked him in the eye. Her expression wasn't angry. It was surgical, focused, final. You didn't come from the streets, Mr. Patel. You came from the shadows. And you've spent your career dragging this country deeper into them, burying truth, silencing dissent, shaping lies in dark rooms and calling it policy. She let that sit. No emotion, just truth, sharp, clean, undeniable. You've weaponized your position to protect the powerful, and you thought no one would see. You thought the mask of authority was enough to erase your trail. But you didn't count on one thing. Some of us learned how to fight back without power. We learned how to speak when we weren't handed a microphone. And we learned that when someone tries to shame you for where you come from, it usually means they're terrified of where you're going. There was still no applause, just silence. The kind that comes when something real has been said. The kind of silence people don't forget. The kind that doesn't need headlines because it already echoes. Patel had tried to smear her name, question her worth, and twist the truth. But Jasmine wasn't in that room to prove her identity. She was there to expose his. And what came next wasn't opinion. It was evidence, cold and final. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't gloat or glance for approval. Instead, she reached into her case with slow, deliberate precision, like someone lighting a match she knew would change the air in the room. What she pulled out was not thick, not flashy, but heavy in a different way. A plain manila folder secured with a red tape seal and marked in capital letters. Authorized eyes only. Classified oversight file. She placed it gently on the table before her fingers resting on the seal for a moment longer than necessary. Then she spoke, not with drama, but with absolute clarity. This is a certified chain of custody intelligence log, recently declassified for congressional review, she said. It details the unauthorized transfer of a classified intelligence package to a private, unsecured server located in Palm Beach County, Florida. A beat. The transfer was personally approved, signed, and time-stamped by Mr. Kash Patel. The air collapsed. Not literally, but emotionally. Every person in the chamber seemed to shrink into their chairs at once. Jasmine didn't pause. She continued with chilling calm. The file in question contained threat-level assessments from 4 intelligence agencies regarding cyber intrusion vulnerabilities within domestic energy infrastructure. It was sent outside the federal network, unencrypted, without proper clearance or internal notice. Her voice sharpened, barely but intentionally, and that same file disappeared from government tracking systems for 62 days. During that time, no one knew where it was, who accessed it, or if it had been copied or leaked. Her words weren't colored by speculation. They were built entirely on the certainty of the paper in front of her. The server in question is now part of an ongoing national investigation involving multiple unsecured transmissions of classified material, she added. And as of today, we have in our possession proof that Mr. Patel was not only aware of the transmission, but facilitated it. Her finger tapped the folder once. His signature appears on the clearance log. Page 4. That was the moment the silence changed shape. No longer tense, it turned stunned, hollow, dangerous. One Republican committee member, a war veteran and longtime intelligence hawk, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His face, once indifferent, now looked bruised by disbelief. Another member, seated 3 chairs down, leaned in and whispered, his voice not meant to carry, but caught nonetheless by a hot mic. This is beyond red lines. No one moved, not Patel, Not the press. Not even the chairman, whose hands had been folded for 20 minutes straight, now rested near the gavel like it had suddenly become necessary. His lips parted slightly, as though he wanted to interrupt. But nothing came out. Only Jasmine's words remained, hanging in the room like smoke. Then at last he cleared his throat. "We'll recess this hearing for 10 minutes, he said, the words brittle at the edges. "All members are advised to review the submitted document immediately and privately." The gavel dropped. Once. Twice. Harder than necessary. What followed wasn't noise. It was movement. A wave of it. Staffers scrambling. Reporters rushing out the doors. Phones pressed to their ears, faces pale with what they just heard. Some members stood frozen, staring at the folder like it might burn through the table. Others walked quickly toward the side chamber, heads down. But in the center of it all, Jasmine Crockett didn't budge. She didn't lean back. She didn't even shift in her seat. She simply watched. Watched the consequences of truth begin to unfold. And in that stillness, surrounded by chaos, she didn't look victorious. She looked resolute. Because she knew the hardest part of exposing the darkness is staying calm while it panics. The 10-minute recess had come and gone, but the silence it left behind hadn't. People returned to their seats with stiff movements and unreadable faces. But everyone knew it. The hearing was no longer about policy. It had become something heavier, something dangerous. Kash Patel re-entered the chamber, flanked by two attorneys. One took the seat behind him. The other hovered close, whispering something sharp and urgent into his left ear. His jaw was tight, and for the first time since the hearing began, his eyes didn't scan the room. He didn't look at the press, the chairman, or even his own bench. He looked only at the table, as if it might open and swallow him whole. Gone was the swagger that had marked his entrance hours ago. Now he looked like a man walking back into a room where the air had shifted in ways he couldn't control. The chairperson resumed the hearing with the same formality as before, but it felt rehearsed now, like someone reciting instructions during a plane crash. "Mr. Patel has retained legal counsel and, per their advisement, will invoke his Fifth Amendment rights for the remainder of the hearing." The chairman's voice was calm, but each word struck like a slow drumbeat. "He will not be answering further questions." A ripple of murmurs spread behind the press wall, followed by the sound of a dozen phones being lifted to capture the moment. But Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She didn't check her notes or glance at the cameras. She was still, utterly, painfully still, her eyes on Patel, her hands calmly resting on a folder that no longer needed to be opened. She waited just long enough for the noise to die down, and then she leaned forward. "Mr. Patel," she said, not with aggression, but with gravity. Her voice had none of the legalistic edge heard earlier. It was softer now, but unmistakably pointed, like steel beneath velvet. "I understand your legal right not to answer questions that may incriminate you. That is your choice." She let the words settle. "But I only have one question left. One that doesn't require an admission of guilt or a denial of anything at all." The room held its breath. She didn't blink. She didn't look away. She simply let the question come, measured, honest, and sharp enough to pierce bone. "How many soldiers have died because of the reports you altered?" The effect was immediate. Every movement in the room ceased. Even the background buzz, the low hum of AC vents and camera equipment, seemed to vanish into a vacuum. Patel didn't move, not a twitch. His eyes remained locked on the polished wood in front of him, but something behind them cracked, subtle but undeniable. His throat bobbed, his shoulders tightened. One of his lawyers placed a steadying hand on his arm, but Patel didn't react. There was no rebuttal, no legal defense, just stillness, and the echo of the question, now suspended in the dead air between them like smoke from a battlefield. It wasn't rhetorical. Jasmine hadn't asked it for effect. She'd asked it because it needed to be said, because someone had to say it. "You may not answer," she continued, her voice slightly quieter, but no less focused. "But I want you to think about it. I want you to picture their faces, men and women who served this country with no knowledge that the intel guiding their missions had been tampered with for political convenience." Her tone never rose. It didn't need to. It carried the weight of truth sharpened to a blade. "They made decisions based on data, moved through hostile territory based on numbers, walked into ambushes based on maps you signed off on. They didn't know, but you did. No one dared move. One of the congressional aides behind the chairperson subtly wiped tears from her cheek with the back of her hand, thinking no one noticed. One of the reporters, usually quick to tweet every breath, sat motionless, mouth slightly open, phone forgotten in her lap. Jasmine leaned in further now, just enough for Patel to feel the full weight of her gaze. "You never pulled a trigger, Mr. Patel, but your pen did." The line struck like a thunderclap, quiet but unstoppable. Patel still didn't look up. His hands were clenched so tightly in front of him, the skin had gone white around the knuckles. He opened his mouth once but said nothing. Not even his lawyer dared speak. Jasmine exhaled slowly, steadying the silence. "We have names now," she said, her voice suddenly softer, but somehow even more cutting. "Not just file numbers. Names, ranks, ages. Some of them had newborns when they deployed. Some of them were 2 weeks from coming home. Some of them—" She stopped, not because she faltered, but because she wouldn't weaponize their grief. "Some of them trusted the people in this room to give them the truth. The injustice didn't lie only in the deception. It lay in the fact that no one had told those families. No one had connected the dots between intelligence fabrication and flag-draped coffins. Until now." She looked toward the chairman, not asking for permission, but as a reminder of who this room was supposed to serve. "We talk about oversight," she said, "about accountability. But it can't mean anything if people can manipulate intelligence, then hide behind legal counsel while others pay the price in blood." She looked back at Patel now, gaze calm but damning. "You don't owe me an answer. You owe them one." That was when Patel finally moved. Not much, just a shift, a deep breath, and a slight downward tilt of his head as if the weight had finally settled on him. His lawyer whispered something again, but he didn't respond. He couldn't. There was no spin left, no exit line, no salvaging the optics. Because the moment wasn't about optics anymore. It was about truth and the cost of bearing it. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full. Full of the things no one wanted to name. Guilt, shame, duty, and the memory of lives sacrificed under false pretenses. Jasmine didn't speak again. She didn't need to. The question had already done what it needed to do. And in that final breathless stillness, with cameras rolling and every eye on Patel, the room felt less like a hearing and more like a trial where only one person knew they'd already been sentenced. The silence from Patel after Jasmine's final question was more than avoidance. It was surrender. But she wasn't finished. The truth had more layers, and she had saved the darkest one for last. Jasmine reached into her folder once more. No hesitation, no dramatic flair, just the quiet precision of someone walking straight through a door she knew would not be closed behind her. This time, what she held wasn't stamped, classified, or marked with security codes. It was plain white paper, printed from an anonymous source, but authenticated by independent forensic experts. "I'd like to enter into the record a series of emails obtained by a protected source," she said, her tone controlled, clinical, but carrying the low voltage of something dangerous. "These exchanges are between Mr. Patel and senior representatives of a private intelligence consulting firm known as Midian Strategies, which has received substantial dark money contributions from multiple unnamed donors." She paused. The subject line of the lead message reads, quote, "Adjustment request, mutual legal security." A quiet ripple moved through the chamber. She tapped the paper lightly on the desk. In simpler terms, a deal, help shift intelligence narratives, and in exchange, receive funding for legal defense. She let the words settle like dust over the room. And they did, heavily. The chairman leaned forward, frowning. "Are these communications verified?" "They are," Jasmine replied, "through a third-party authentication protocol. Full header data, IP tracebacks, and hash signatures have been preserved. They've been reviewed by the Oversight Committee in closed session. All members here were notified of the packet submission 2 hours prior to the hearing." Her words weren't sharp, but they left no room for denial. Jasmine flipped to the first page. Email dated April 9th, 2022, from a Midian executive. We'll ensure the language in the March 21st summary reaches the right ears. If you can guarantee coordination and confirmation by end of Q2, in return, legal support is already set aside from the domestic fund. Discretion is assumed. She looked up, then directly at Patel. Care to explain what legal support was being purchased in exchange for coordination on intelligence language? Patel said nothing. His face had drained of color. He reached into his jacket slowly, pulled out a handkerchief, and dabbed at the sweat building on his temple. He no longer tried to speak over her, no longer shifted in theatrical annoyance. This time, he looked like a man who understood the walls were not only closing in, they had already locked. "Mr. Patel?" Jasmine asked again, this time softer, more surgical than confrontational. "Did you knowingly allow private actors to influence the content of federal threat reports in exchange for personal legal protection?" Her tone didn't accuse, it unveiled. One committee member leaned forward, lips parted, stunned. Another shook his head slowly, stunned that the hearing had descended from defense into exposure so completely. Patel's lips parted slightly. A tremor ran across his jaw. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no answer came. Instead, he wiped his brow again, more forcefully this time. Then, with eyes lowered and voice rough like gravel dragged across dry cement, he spoke. I cannot confirm or deny the contents of that email chain." A single sentence, 9 words, and yet they thundered across the room louder than any denial ever could. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She just nodded once, acknowledging, not celebrating. Let the record reflect that the witness does not dispute the authenticity of the documents. Her hands folded again, still calm, still controlled. But her voice held something else now, a solemn weight that had grown heavier with every layer peeled back. "We've heard testimony about misused power. We've seen evidence of altered intelligence, lost data, compromised national security. But this isn't just negligence. This is corruption in its purest form, trading truth for protection and doing so while cloaked in clearance." Patel said nothing. He couldn't. His entire body language, folded shoulders, downward gaze, clenched hands, was that of a man stripped of defense. His lawyers didn't interrupt. Even they seemed to understand that nothing they could say would rewrite the moment that had just unfolded. The chairperson looked stunned. For the first time all day, he didn't reach for his gavel. He didn't ask for silence. He didn't move, because everyone in the room understood the magnitude of what had just been spoken into the record. It wasn't just political scandal. It wasn't even just national betrayal. It was personal, real, human, the kind of truth that lives in whispers and footnotes, until someone like Jasmine Crockett walks in and reads it aloud in full voice, in full light. One of the younger staffers along the back wall covered her mouth. A reporter shook his head slowly, typing nothing. There were no notes that could capture what had just been said. No spin that could frame it softer. Jasmine sat back slightly, her eyes still locked on Patel. "You don't have to confirm it. The silence did that for you." Her voice remained calm, but her words were like a closing door. "What matters now is that the country knows. They know what happened. They know why. And they know who." Patel exhaled, slow and ragged, as if he had been holding his breath through the entire collapse of his career. And all Jasmine did was sit still, hands folded, eyes clear, not triumphant, not cruel, just truthful, because she hadn't come here to crush a man. She'd come to hold one accountable for the lies he had signed, the silence he had sold, and the trust he had betrayed. The hearing had ended, but its impact hadn't. Truth once spoken has a velocity of its own, and by the next morning, it was already moving faster than anyone could control. Within 12 hours of the hearing's adjournment, the transcript had been downloaded over 5 million times. Clips of Jasmine's questioning flooded every major news outlet. Her line, "You didn't pull the trigger, Mr. Patel, but your pen did," trended across platforms, translated into 7 languages, and plastered across evening news banners from Washington to London. But while the public erupted with shock, outrage, and vindication, Something quieter was happening behind closed doors. Something faster, more precise. Before the sun even rose on the East Coast, the FBI had launched a preliminary review, not just based on the documents submitted, but on the consistency between Patel's silence and the mountains of evidence now under federal seal. By 8:04 a.m., an internal memo had been circulated within the Department of Justice. Its subject line was unambiguous. Preliminary clearance suspension request, Cash Patel. At 8:37 a.m., the FBI formally notified the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. And by 9:05 a.m., an order was signed. Patel was to be summoned for immediate questioning, his active clearances frozen pending full investigation. The command was quiet but absolute. No press releases, no cameras, just a message delivered straight to his counsel. Your client is expected at the Hoover Building by 2 p.m. today. No exceptions. Patel was in his private residence outside Alexandria when he received the call. According to sources later cited in leaked briefings, he didn't react with anger. He didn't throw anything, shout, or deny. He simply sat down on the edge of his kitchen counter and stared at the floor, the phone still pressed to his ear long after the line had gone dead. The silence of consequence had arrived. Not public yet, not dramatic, but lethal in its precision. And unlike the hearings, there would be no stage to spin this part, no friendly pundits, no lifeline of ambiguity. At exactly 1:52 p.m., Patel walked into the J. Edgar Hoover Building with one attorney and no entourage. He wore a navy blue suit and sunglasses, despite the overcast sky. Waiting for him were 3 federal agents from the National Security Division and 2 intelligence officers from the DOJ's Office of Counterintelligence. No one smiled. No one greeted him by name. He was escorted past the reception, through 2 checkpoints, and into a soundproofed interview room designed for high-clearance debriefs. The walls were gray. The lighting was soft, but the silence was surgical. On the table lay a black folder, thinner than Jasmine's but heavier in consequence. Inside, authenticated copies of the emails, the server logs, the signed transfer order, and the whistleblower's original memo, now corroborated by 2 independent sources. Patel sat down slowly, his attorney to his left. No cuffs, no formal arrest. But the gravity was unmistakable. The kind of room where careers didn't end loudly. They collapsed under the weight of paper and silence. We'll begin by confirming the integrity of your clearance pathway, one agent said, voice flat. At this time, your access to classified materials, secured systems, and active policy briefings is formally suspended under federal statute. He slid a typed notification across the table. This is the preliminary suspension of your Tier 3 clearance authority, effective immediately. You are not to access any classified network, device, or contact under Title 50 operations until further notice. Patel stared at the page, then nodded once. Barely. His lawyer attempted a procedural objection, something about needing more time to review the chain of custody, but it was ignored. The agents weren't here to argue. They were here to document, to listen, to give Patel a chance to speak before the narrative was written without him. But he said nothing. No denial, no protest, no rebuttal. He simply folded his hands in front of him, elbows tight, shoulders drawn in like a man trying to shrink inside himself. Outside, the media hadn't caught wind yet. There were no vans, no reporters. But inside the intelligence community, the shockwaves were already moving. At Langley, his profile was flagged as pending declassification. At Fort Meade, a mirror audit had begun on every document he had signed or reviewed over the last 30 months. And in a sealed chamber beneath the Capitol, a separate review panel had been summoned, tasked with one question: was there a deliberate effort to manipulate intelligence policy for personal legal protection? Jasmine Crockett had done her part in the open. Now the machine was doing its part in the dark. For Patel, the loss of clearance wasn't just a suspension. It was a collapse of identity. Clearance had been his shield, his currency, his cloak of power. Without it, he wasn't a policymaker. He wasn't even a reliable witness. He was just a man with secrets and fewer allies every hour. As the interview continued, agents didn't yell or accuse. They didn't need to. They asked about timelines, about who else knew, about the metadata trail, about the off-site meetings with legal defense liaisons. Patel's lawyer answered most of it, but toward the end, one agent leaned forward, lowered his voice, and asked, "Was it worth it?" Patel didn't respond, not because he didn't know, but because he did. The session ended at 5:12 p.m. No handshakes, no conclusions, just documents signed, badges returned, and an escort back to the private elevator that led to the underground exit. Patel stepped out into a cold wind with no press, no photos, no statement, only silence. But across the country, the public had already filled the gap. News of the FBI summons leaked at 6:47 p.m., confirmed by 3 anonymous federal sources, and picked up within minutes by every major network. The headline was swift and brutal. Kash Patel summoned by FBI, security clearance suspended in wake of explosive hearing. By 9 p.m., the country knew what the hearing had only begun to unveil. This wasn't just a scandal. It was a breach, a betrayal, a reckoning. And for the first time in years, the man who had once moved in and out of classified rooms like a shadow had been pulled into the light. And there, finally, the system turned its full attention to him. Quietly, precisely, irreversibly. By the time Patel walked out of the Hoover building under federal summons, the institutions that once shielded him were already starting to fracture, and the media battleground was the first to splinter. The right-wing media ecosystem, long known for its discipline and unity, began to crack in real time. What had been a reliable chorus of defense, the same headlines, the same spin, suddenly shifted into dissonance. That night at exactly 7:03 p.m., Fox News anchor Troy Bledsoe opened his segment not with defiance, but with hesitation. If these documents are what they appear to be, then this goes beyond politics. Within minutes, the echo chamber splintered. Some hosts doubled down, calling the hearing a witch hunt and labeling Jasmine Crockett a grandstanding radical who weaponized the process. But others, more cautious, more calculated, began to walk backward without admitting it. Phrases like "still gathering facts," "troubling if true," and "unconfirmed but concerning" peppered the primetime panels. On Newsmax, a normally Patel-friendly commentator fell quiet after a live caller asked, "Would you let your son walk into combat with intel written by this man?" The shift wasn't loud. It was quiet, deliberate, the kind of silence that creeps in when power senses it's backing the wrong figure. Patel's defenders no longer led with confidence. They hedged, they deflected, they changed the subject. A well-known think tank quietly deleted 3 articles praising his leadership. A former ally on Capitol Hill tweeted a vague call for renewed integrity and intelligence, without mentioning his name. The rift widened when an internal leak from a conservative publication revealed an editorial order. "Hold on, Patel pieces. Await DOJ developments." It wasn't betrayal, it was abandonment, coded in plausible deniability. Meanwhile, the rest of the country had already moved faster than the networks. On Twitter, on TikTok, in classrooms, in comment threads, and op-ed columns, one name surged forward. Not Patel's, but Jasmine's. She had gone from relative unknown to household name overnight, not because she had shouted or grandstanded or played to the cameras, but because she had done something almost extinct in modern government. She had simply told the truth and refused to flinch. One clip of her questioning, "You didn't pull the trigger, Mr. Patel, but your pen did," had over 42 million views by morning. It was remixed into protest songs, taught in civics classes, turned into murals in 2 different cities. But more than all that, it prompted a singular question to dominate the national conversation. If Jasmine Crockett hadn't been in that room, would the country have ever known? The question wasn't rhetorical, it was a mirror, and people didn't like what they saw. Talk radio lit up with callers, not pundits, not politicians, ordinary veterans, military families, civil servants. A retired colonel from Georgia called into a national program and said, "I've read every word of that transfer report. That's not politics, that's betrayal." And that woman had the guts to say it out loud while everyone else sat there afraid. Another caller, a nurse whose husband had been deployed during the years in question, broke down mid-sentence, her voice cracking as she whispered, "We trusted the system, we trusted the paper in front of us, and it was a lie. Jasmine's face appeared on magazine covers, not as a celebrity, but as a warning shot, an image of a woman who had walked into a room built to silence her and refused to leave quietly. The New York Times ran a full-page headline, "The Truth She Refused to Edit." A Washington Post op-ed simply read, "Her questions changed the room, and then the country." But not everyone welcomed the truth. She received threats, dozens, anonymous messages, veiled warnings, hate mail disguised as concern. Online forums accused her of treason. A small but vocal group began spreading conspiracies, claiming the documents were fake, the witness staged, the evidence planted. Some pundits on fringe networks accused her of undermining national security for personal gain. But the more they shouted, the more they revealed their desperation. Because the evidence wasn't going away. The signatures weren't going away. The whistleblower wasn't retracting. And Jasmine wasn't backing down. In fact, she hadn't said a word publicly since the hearing ended. No interviews, no victory lap, no self-congratulations. Just silence. And the storm it left in her wake. For those watching closely, it was clear. Jasmine Crockett had never set out to go viral. She hadn't chased the spotlight. She had chased the truth. And that truth, once out, didn't need to scream. It had already landed. And now the country couldn't stop asking itself, why did it take her to say it? Where were the others? How long had this gone unchecked? Because if the truth could sit in a folder for months, hidden behind clearance stamps and sealed doors, if soldiers could die while someone quietly rewrote the threat levels, then the danger wasn't just one man named Patel. The danger was the system that thought it could get away with it until her. The country watched Kash Patel sink under the weight of undeniable evidence. But long after the hearings ended, the real reckoning arrived. Not in handcuffs or press releases, but in one woman's decision to face the public with nothing but truth. The air on the Capitol steps was brittle. Cold in that way only Washington in winter knows how to deliver. Clear sky, no wind, but a chill that settled into bone. Still the crowd gathered, not with protest signs or party colors, but in quiet numbers. Students, veterans, retired judges, journalists, mothers holding toddlers in fleece hats. They had come not for spectacle, not even for justice, but for the one thing the hearing had reminded them they were still owed: honesty. Dozens of cameras stood in perfect symmetry at the foot of the Capitol. Satellite vans lined the street like war trucks. In the hour before her scheduled remarks, news anchors murmured over teleprompters, unsure what tone to strike. Was this a victory lap? A resignation? A declaration of war? And then she emerged. Jasmine Crockett didn't walk out like a politician. She walked out like a woman who had just survived fire and come back holding the blueprints for the building she was ready to burn down. No staffers flanked her. No music played. Just the heavy echo of her heels on the marble as she stepped alone into the center of the platform, behind a simple podium framed by two rustling American flags. The microphones hissed as they came alive, but she waited. Her eyes swept across the sea of faces, blinking under the sharp morning light. She looked neither triumphant nor exhausted, only still, composed in a way that told everyone watching. This was not the end of something. This was the start of something much harder. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, measured, and so quiet at first that the crowd instinctively leaned forward. "This is not my victory," she began. "This is your wake-up call." Not applause, not chants. "Just breathe," she continued. "What you saw in that hearing room was not rare. It was not new. It was not shocking to the people who've spent years watching truth be buried in sealed folders, rewritten by people with clearance and immunity. What made it different was that this time, someone said no. Her words moved like waves, unhurried but undeniable. She didn't gesture, didn't lean on theatrics. She didn't need to, because every syllable was lined with the weight of what she had witnessed and what she had revealed. We talk a lot in this country about protecting freedom. But what is freedom if the truth can be bought? What is freedom if our soldiers die under the shadow of a lie? What is freedom if evidence disappears until someone with nothing to gain and everything to lose dares to say it out loud? The crowd still didn't clap, because this didn't feel like a speech. It felt like testimony. This isn't about party or power. This isn't about one man named Patel. This is about what happens when institutions are built to silence those who don't look like they belong, until one of us refuses to play along. Then she paused, and in the silence the only sound was the clicking of a single camera shutter. Then 2, then 20. "If we don't protect the truth," she said, her voice now steady as iron, "then the truth will fall into the hands of those who rewrite it." That line dropped into the cold air like an iron anchor. The crowd didn't cheer, but something deeper happened. Heads nodded, hands rose slowly to hearts. A few eyes filled with tears, not out of grief, but out of the rare shock that someone had finally said it, publicly, without flinching. Jasmine stood for a beat longer, letting the words hang. Then without a smile, without a wave, she stepped back from the podium and turned, and walked away. Not down the main stairs where cameras waited for close-ups, but to the side, through a narrow path cleared only minutes before. She moved past aides and marshals, past the marble lions, into a hallway of shadow that swallowed her without sound. The news cycle exploded within minutes. Her face flooded every major network. The line, "If we don't protect the truth," was played on repeat like scripture. Morning shows called it the most powerful speech since Watergate. An editor at The Atlantic tweeted, "This isn't a press conference, this is a doctrine." And then, like clockwork, came the speculation. Would she run? By noon, anonymous sources whispered that 3 donors had offered her a blank check to launch a Senate campaign. By 2 p.m., a PSC had been formed under her name, without her permission. By evening, panels of pundits argued over her future like she was no longer a person, but a symbol on a chessboard. The next morning, she gave her answer. A single email, no press conference, no political theater. Just a plain white PDF posted to her congressional site. "I will not be seeking higher office. I am not interested in power. I am interested in prevention. Corruption does not begin at the top. It begins in the quiet. That's where I'll be." The internet fractured. Some hailed her as a patriot. Others called her a coward for not capitalizing on the moment. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't reply. She didn't spin, because she hadn't come to build a brand. She had come to tell the truth. She returned to her district, quietly. She resumed her work. She met with legal reform groups. She spoke at universities. She kept her head down in hearings no one broadcast, but where policies were quietly shaped, because Jasmine Crockett never believed justice lived in headlines. But the country did not forget. Clips of her questioning Patel were still taught in law schools 2 years later. A civics curriculum was rewritten in 3 states to include her final hearing exchange as an example of modern oversight. Students gave speeches in competitions quoting her word for word. Memorial scholarships were created in the names of soldiers whose deaths had been linked to falsified intelligence. And yet, one question never left the air. It was whispered on train rides and in newsroom halls, muttered by government analysts and law professors. If what Jasmine revealed was just the tip of the iceberg, then what's still buried beneath the surface? The question was too big for a single name, too frightening for a single answer. But it lingered. It still does. And after the hearings ended, after the headlines faded, and after Jasmine Crockett disappeared once more into the corridors of power, what remained wasn't just the silence she left behind. It was the lesson carved into the country's conscience like a scar. The real lesson of the Patel hearings didn't live in legal statutes or Senate memos. It wasn't written in the final report or buried inside classified folders. It lived in the space between Jasmine's questions and Patel's silence. It lived in the single trembling pause before she asked, "How many soldiers died because of the reports you altered?" It lived in the way a woman from a background the system was built to ignore stood against an intelligence officer backed by secrecy, wealth, and silence, and didn't blink. The message was clear, and it burned. In a world where power can edit the truth, integrity must be louder than access. Jasmine had no army, no donors, no safety net. She only had her voice, and she used it not to destroy, but to expose, not to rise, but to reveal. And in doing so, she reminded the country that the most dangerous people in a corrupt system are not those who shout. They're the ones who speak plainly when it's most dangerous to do so. The injustice she faced was not just personal, it was generational. She walked into that hearing carrying every room she'd been told to leave, every credential she'd had to earn twice, every moment she was talked over, doubted, or dismissed. Her skin, her gender, her accent, all of it had been used against her before the first question even left her mouth. But instead of folding under the weight, she turned it into gravity. She never raised her voice, because she didn't have to. The louder the world tried to ignore her, the more undeniable her presence became. And in that act of standing, of speaking, of not stepping back, she taught every person watching that resistance doesn't always roar. Sometimes it stands. Sometimes it asks a single question that shakes an empire. We often talk about heroes as people who change laws, win wars, or hold offices. But Jasmine's story redefined what heroism looks like in a democracy on the edge of forgetting itself. Her courage wasn't in confrontation, it was in clarity, in walking into a chamber stacked against her and trusting the truth to hold, in choosing to reveal the infection rather than wear the badge. She didn't chase cameras. She faced consequences, and her refusal to be seduced by power became a mirror for the rest of us, forcing us to ask how many truths we've allowed to be buried for comfort, for loyalty, for convenience. If there is a lasting human lesson in what happened, it is this: silence is not neutral. Every time a lie goes unchallenged, it learns to speak louder. Every time a voice like Jasmine's is ignored, the machinery of corruption spins faster. Truth needs more than facts. It needs people willing to carry it into rooms built to break them. People who do not wait to be invited, who do not apologize for existing, who speak not because it's safe, but because it's necessary. Jasmine Crockett didn't just reveal what one man did wrong. She revealed what a system lets happen when no one is watching. And now we are watching. Because once the truth is heard in a room meant to hide it, something changes. Not overnight, not easily, but permanently. Jasmine reminded us that justice is not a destination, it is a demand, one that lives in questions that make people uncomfortable, in moments when silence would be easier, in acts of moral defiance carried out without applause. Her lesson isn't just about Patel, it's about us, about what we tolerate, about what we excuse, about what we're willing to forget to preserve the illusion that everything is fine. But everything is not fine. And Jasmine didn't fix it. She just made sure we could no longer say we didn't know. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.